referendum on Trudeau and the government's approach to COVID more generally. So I think that's clearly a core issue. I think that's a core issue everywhere in the world. But beyond that, certainly from a British perspective, I don't think most people know many other issues that are kind of at play at the moment in Canada.
So as this election unfolds and as we sort of get closer to voting day and results day, is there anything that you're sort of interested in observing about our election and our sort of political process as it is unfolding?
Yeah, I think as like one of the first major elections to take place post-COVID or during COVID even, I think it'll be really interesting to see how that shape plays into things. Obviously, we had the Biden-Trump showdown in the US, so that was like really during peak COVID. But looking at as the dust is settling more, seeing the issues people begin to care about again. So there's major topics that are kind of big issues around the world, be that things like climate change, immigration, populism, all these kind of big factors and trends. And as COVID stops warping the world and stops pulling all focus towards it, it'll be interesting to see kind of how the cards land afterwards. Which topics are people still interested in? Has COVID changed people's viewpoint? Is it some big unifying factor that pulls people together again? Or is it going to divide us further than ever? And obviously, one country isn't going to be able to tell us that. Your elections alone can't really indicate global trends. But as a really major global election and one that is a country that is electing a major global leader, I think it'll be really interesting to see how you guys have reacted to that and how that's going to play as a domino effect as we head into other elections in Germany and France and other countries around the world.
Well, you kind of answered, Jack, what I was going to ask as sort of my last question, which was, do you think the outcome of the Canadian election matters either to Britain or indeed the wider world?
Yeah, I think they definitely are relevant. I think Canada is clearly one of the leading nations in a number of different areas. And as we're tackling more and more global issues, things like I've already mentioned, things like climate change, things like migration, and looking at how we handle those topics, I think it's really important that we see which leaders are being elected, who is on the world stage at things like the G7 and things like that. It's who are those world leaders? And obviously one country's leader alone isn't necessarily going to shape any of those things or any of those decisions, but looking at the trends and looking at, is your next leader standing for things like dealing with climate change, tackling the next pandemic as a global issue? That's going to affect everyone. From a British perspective, the domestic issues don't matter all that much because those are your problems and we don't really have a right in saying how you should vote on those. But equally, the way that the person that's chosen and the direction you're heading will definitely impact the rest of the world because of the precedent that's being set. And the kind of language and the rhetoric that stands around your new leader, I think, could really impact these big issues that we have and we're facing as a global community.
This might be a somewhat unfair kind of gotcha question to ask you, Jack, but do you have a sense of the guy who's running against Trudeau?
Not particularly, if I'm being honest. Obviously, we wrote the script, or I didn't write the script, someone else wrote the script, which is why my answer is no. But from reading the script and from reading just generally about the Canadian election, I don't know that much. I think, as I say, I think that's broadly true of much of the UK. But having come out of this and coming out of my conversation with you, and as we get closer, I will definitely be following up on it more and we will be covering it more. So hopefully I'll get a better picture, but I think I am not unlike most other Brits in saying, no, unfortunately I don't.
Well, I appreciate your honesty, Jack. Thanks so much for doing this.
No worries.
All right. Now, the second person I wanted to hear from was my friend Bastiat, who is a pretty popular political streamer over on Twitch, where he often hosts debates and interviews and other twitchy things of that sort. He considers himself a proud neoliberal and is pretty well-versed in politics. And he has what I would describe as an above-average literacy in Canadian politics for an American. So I was interested to hear his take. Okay, so thanks so much for doing this with me.
Yeah, for sure. Always a pleasure to talk to you, JJ. Really appreciate your content. And it's great to get the opportunity to sit down with an insightful thought leader on Canadian politics. So,
thank you so much for that. Flattery, sir. The first question I just want to ask you is, to what extent do you think that people in America are aware that Canada has an election going on right now?
I don't think they are at all aware, except perhaps in the thinnest, most superficial fashion, that there's an election going on in Canada between the COVID pandemic in the longer term and the Afghan withdrawal going on right now in the near term, I'd say that Americans are just not paying much attention.
But let's say among the sort of elite Americans, or sort of those Americans who for some reason or another have bothered to make it their business to know about this election, what do you think would be sort of the general narrative about the way that this election is going?
I'd say that the general narrative among those Americans, those kind of people who I follow, who follow this stuff, is that Justin Trudeau has called this election primarily for the purpose of, essentially exclusively for the purpose of building a majority in the Canadian Parliament, and then beyond that, really, he's pretty likely to get it based on how parliamentary systems work, based on how previous Canadian elections have worked out toward that end, and that it's just not much of an event.
And what's your sense of sort of the issues of this election?
Well, from what I gather, the biggest issue in Canada right now is the response to the pandemic. And I don't know if there's this sort of desire among the Canadian public to, I guess to borrow a phrase from President Biden, build back better and think about what's next after the pandemic, or if people are still feeling very much in the thick of it. I would imagine that they are no more inclined to feel like they're in the thick of it, given that the Canadians are much more vaccinated per capita than Americans are, even though there was a bit of a late start to that. But it seems like the big question is, was it a good response to the pandemic, and is Justin Trudeau equipped and able and ready to take on what's next?
So this was something I asked the other guy. Do you have a sense of the person who is running against Justin Trudeau?
So as I understand it, in Canada, there are three main parties. The Liberal Party, which is essentially the quote-unquote natural governing party, in the sense that it is the largest and that if it runs a good campaign, has the best chance of winning an election. Beyond them, though, there are the Conservatives, who I believe represent just about all of the Canadian right, apart from the very fringes of the fringe. The Canadian Conservatives are led right now by a man by the name of Aaron O'Toole, who seems to be, certainly from an American context, very weakly conservative. He seems to have some conservative aesthetics. I've heard him talk a little bit about woke culture, but at the same time, I have seen him, in fact, just today, actually. I wasn't digging around for this. I saw this pop up on Twitter. I saw that he has promoted an idea that Canadian Conservatives will ensure that Canadian workplaces, I don't know what the threshold or cutoff is, but at least large Canadian companies will have what the Germans call, what is this? Oh, co-determination. That's what it is, co-determination. Whatever you think of it, it's not really a conservative idea. I know that he's got some kind of plan for climate change and global warming, but it seems to be the case, too, that anytime the Canadian Conservatives talk about it, the plan is described as not really being there, or as being nonsensical or just pointless. So they never seem to get any credit for these very liberal type policies. Apparently he's also pro-choice, which seems like sort of a strange position for somebody who presumably represents a lot of religious conservatives as well. Yeah, the only thing I can say is that as far as conservative positions go, I have heard that he is very, very supportive of the energy industry in Canada, and that although he wants a carbon tax, which, again, the merits of all of this aside, not traditionally viewed as a conservative type policy, and he can talk the game about Canada first and down with the woke culture, but it doesn't seem to really mean anything.
And what about the, you sort of alluded to being that there was three main parties, so talk about the other one.
Yes, so the New Democratic Party, the NDP with Jagmeet Singh, and they don't seem to have too much to offer alternatively beyond, I suppose, the Liberals. In fact, it seems like they try to play a sort of game that I've seen some people on the left here in the United States play when they're trying to say, Bernie got